Should I do a Roth conversion? It's one of the most common questions I get, and we're going to answer it today. Thanks for joining me. I'm Elliot Apple of Kindness Financial Planning, founder and lead financial planner. And today, we're going to get all into Roth conversions. First, what is a Roth conversion? A Roth conversion is where you move money from a pre-tax account to a tax-free account, such as an IRA to a Roth IRA. So in essence, what you're doing is you're purposefully recognizing income today at whatever your ordinary income tax rate is and moving it from that account that will be taxed later to an account that's being taxed today but then will go tax-free. The first aspect that you'll need to understand about Roth conversions is that the money in your traditional IRA or your 401k, any pre-tax accounts, it's not 100% yours. Uncle Sam is investing alongside you. You've gotten that tax deferral for many years, and at some point, the government's going to want their cut. So they're actually a partner in that account. For example, if you have $1 million in there, and let's say you were able to fully distribute the $1 million at a 25% tax rate. You wouldn't be able to do this likely, but I'm just giving it as an example. That $1 million is really only worth $750,000 to you personally. Again, you see the $1 million account balance, but if you were to distribute it, you can't actually get $1 million worth of purchasing power out of it. You can only get $750,000 in that example. That concept is really important to understand because when we do an analysis of whether it makes sense to do a Roth conversion, it really comes down to what tax rate are you going to pay today on any Roth conversion versus what amount are you going to have to pay in the future when you take ordinary income withdrawals from your IRA, such as when the government forces money out at age 72 via your required minimum distribution, or just spending in general. Let's look at a really simple example before we get into something more complex, just to really further explore this idea that the rate you pay today versus the rate in the future is really the deciding factor here, because many people often ask, well, what about the lost earnings on the taxes or other things? And that doesn't matter, and I'm going to prove it in this very short example. Both Gail and Bruce have $100 currently in their retirement account. Gail says, hey, I'm comfortable doing a Roth conversion, and I'm going to pay an effective rate of 20% on any Roth conversion. So I'm going to go ahead and pay $20 today, convert the entire account to the Roth IRA. So net of that, Gail is going to have $80 that is then growing tax-free. Bruce takes a different approach. Bruce says, I don't want to pay the tax today. I'm going to defer that down the road. And his money is going to grow during that time period, and he's going to start with more. Let's say after 1 year, just as a simple example, that they earn 5% on this account. Gil started with $80 and is growing to $84. Bruce started with $100 and that grows to $105. Now, if they were both to distribute that money, how much do they have? Well, in this simple example, since Gail already paid the tax and it's coming out tax-free in this simple example, Gail has $84. Bruce, on the other hand, also has $84. If we assume that Bruce also pays a 20% effective rate, which is what Gail paid at the start, Bruce is paying $21 in taxes, and when you subtract the $21 from the $105, you get $84. So they have the same purchasing power. They both have the same $84. So you can see here, one had a 20% effective rate at the beginning, one had it at the end. Once they finally distribute that money, it's the same amount. And so this is really important to understand. So if you don't, go back, rewatch the video, watch this portion, because you need to understand this piece if you're going to understand the rest of the video. Now, let's go a little bit further with a more complicated example. Maybe you didn't quite believe me with the simple example, or you just want to see it extended out with larger dollar figures. Let's take Gail and Bruce again. Gail's going to do the same thing. She's going to pay a 20% effective rate and do a Roth conversion, but this time it's going to be on $1 million. So net of that, she's going to have $800,000 growing tax-free. Bruce, on the other hand, is going to say again, I don't want to do a Roth conversion. I'll just pay the tax later. So Bruce starts investing, Gail starts investing, but Gail is going to start with $200,000 less in this situation. Let's assume that they both earn 5% over the next 10 years, and we can see the balances here on what they have year by year. But what you'll notice is at the end of this, Bruce looks like he has more money, but again, Bruce has to take the distribution, and then when he does that, he's going to pay a 20% effective tax rate. Now, in reality, this probably wouldn't be a 20% effective tax rate, but I just want to illustrate the concept that if you pay the same rate of tax later as you do today, you're no better off doing a Roth conversion. But if someone could pay a lower rate of tax today versus in the future, that's when it makes sense to do a Roth conversion. But I'm just showing a simple example with the same effective tax rate to show the math and why this matters and why there's not any sort of lost money to taxes, because it's money that you haven't paid yet, but it's already been earmarked by the government. Since we've already looked at two examples, let's talk a little bit more broadly about specific examples of when a Roth conversion makes sense. You've already seen it, but to just make it more clear, anytime that you can pay a lower tax rate today than you estimate that you'll be able to pay in the future, it likely makes sense to do a Roth conversion. Now, I'm not one to sort of estimate where tax rates are going, whether they're going up or down. If I were a betting man, well, I won't share that, but you could probably guess which way I think tax rates are going. But even if they were to stay the same, or the current trajectory that we're on, we are on a path right now where in the year 2026, we're going to go back to the old tax rates that we had in 2017, adjusted for inflation. And those tax rates, they were higher. And they were higher at smaller levels of income. Right now, we have pretty wide brackets compared to what we might be in the future. And the tax rates are lower today. You can fit, particularly for married filing jointly, quite a bit of income in the 22% and 24% tax bracket. People who are in the 22% tax bracket today may find themselves in the 25% or 28% tax bracket in 2026, assuming similar levels of income. People in the 24% tax bracket may find themselves in the 28% or 33% tax bracket, again, assuming similar levels of income. And I say similar levels of income because we do need to do a tax projection. That is the important part of doing this Roth conversion analysis, is we need to estimate what your tax rate will be today and project that out into the future when Social Security starts or requirement of distribution start, or if they already have, what that may look like later as more and more money gets pushed out of your retirement accounts. So with that said, a lot of circumstances where a Roth conversion makes sense is if you've retired early and you haven't started collecting Social Security, or you're not forced to take required minimum distributions yet, and maybe you're living off your brokerage account or other cash savings and not distributing money from your IRA. If your spouse is about to pass away, maybe this is the last year that you can file as married filing jointly, and next year you'll file as a single filer. But you may have really similar levels of income at that point, and you'll, in a way, sort of be penalized for that higher income because the brackets aren't as wide for single filers. If you've taken time off work and you have less income today, maybe you're taking a sabbatical, a Roth conversion can make a lot of sense. Basically, anytime you're in a lower income year, a Roth conversion may have some potential. And I think for a lot of people in the 22 and the 24% tax bracket today that may see similar levels of income in the year 2026, which is only a couple years away, it could make a lot of sense to potentially do a Roth conversion and start moving some money from pre-tax to a tax-free bucket. When in the year should you do a Roth conversion? This is really anybody's guess, but there are some rules of thumb that you can follow and some strategies. As I mentioned earlier, ideally, you are doing this earlier in the year. If markets are up, say, 7 out of 10 times, usually it makes sense to do that earlier in the year so you can get that tax-free growth inside of the Roth IRA as opposed to tax-deferred in the IRA. Now, that poses a problem for some people because you may have high capital gain distributions, you may receive a payout that you're unaware of, you may be self-employed and still working and not sure what your income will end up being for the year. So if that's you, you could just wait until the end of the year and do a projection when you have a better idea of what your income will be. Or another strategy is to do a partial conversion earlier in the year and then true it up at the end of the year. So you could do a conversion in January. Let's say in an example, you want to do $100,000, just sticking with that number. Maybe you do $50,000 earlier in the year because you know your income won't necessarily be above that to push you into a higher bracket. You do $50,000 at the beginning, and then you true it up at the end of the year. Maybe you have higher income than anticipated, so the other $50,000 you're going to do, maybe you bring that down to $25,000. Again, just throwing out random numbers here just to give you an example of how you could do this. One other strategy you could do that is really beneficial is to do Roth conversions when the market has declined. Now, if you've listened to any of my other videos or my blog, you know I don't try to market time, right? Research has shown you can't do that consistently. So why am I suggesting doing this when the market is down? Well, we do know that the market is down, and during those time periods, you can move more shares for the same dollar value. So again, if we're sticking with the $100,000, if the market is down, say 20%, you can move more of those shares, and then when the recovery happens, all that recovery happens in the tax-free account as opposed to the tax-deferred account. A really simple example is if we go back to the COVID pandemic in March of 2020, markets fell, let's call it 25% just for easy math. Well, if you converted during that time period when markets were down 25%, all of the growth that you had after that point, and it was a really quick rebound, if you did a conversion near the low, all of that growth occurred in the tax-free account. So you can imagine how beneficial that is if you did that conversion during that time. And no one knew that was going to be the low. If you did this during 2008 or 2009, you could have done a conversion and it would have continued to go down probably a few more times. But eventually that growth all occurred tax-free in the Roth IRA. So there's no necessarily trigger point that I'd say 10% do it or 20% or 30%. Go ahead and do the Roth conversion. It's just if the market is down, it's typically not a bad time to do the conversion because you can get more shares over to that Roth IRA. And then when the growth does rebound, if it does, then all that will be tax-free. The one other approach that you could consider to doing a Roth conversion, if you don't want to do a partial at the beginning or at the end, or wait for the market to be down during the year, because it may not go down. That may not be a good strategy. And when I say when the market is down, it's more if you are going to do it that year and haven't done it yet, doing it when the market is down is good. I wouldn't necessarily wait for the market to go down because we know sometimes markets are up in a year or don't decline as much as we thought they might. But the other strategy that you could do is to take what I would call more of a dollar cost average approach. Many people are familiar with their 401k, adding money regularly each month or each pay period into it. You could do a similar approach for the Roth conversion. I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing it monthly, but you could. But let's say you wanted to do $100,000 in a year. You could decide to do, say, $25,000 a quarter, just as an example. The exact time period or how you work this out isn't really as important as the fact that you just have a strategy for it and commit to that throughout the year, knowing that if the market does fall, maybe you want to accelerate a little bit of that. So if you want to do $25,000 the first quarter and then the market falls 30%, maybe you accelerate a little bit of the dollar cost averaging and do a slightly larger Roth conversion just to take advantage of the fact that the market has fallen. Just ideas out there. I'm not necessarily recommending one strategy or the other, just different ways to think about it. Now, how do you actually do a Roth conversion? Sometimes the actual mechanics of this can be a little bit tough depending on what custodian you use, but ideally, or at least what I often do, is I move positions in an investment account. So if you already own XYZ fund inside of your IRA, you should be able to move that directly from your IRA to your Roth IRA. Now, you may not be able to get the exact amount. So if you're trying to do, say, $100,000, you might be a little above or below that. It's just something to keep in mind as market values change. Ideally, you're not selling to cash and then rebuying in the Roth IRA. You can do that. You could sell the $100,000 in the IRA, wait a few days for it to settle, do the Roth conversion to the Roth, and then rebuy that or rebuy something else inside the Roth. You can do that, but I tend to not like to be out of the market and be fully participating on those days. And if you sell and rebuy, you may have roughly a week span where you're not inside the market. And that's okay if you want to do that or you're limited by your custodian, but you can usually move investment positions. Something to pay attention to anytime you do a Roth conversion analysis and you're trying to determine how much money you might want to move from an IRA to a Roth IRA is how that will affect your Medicare premiums. Because this comes as a major surprise to many people in that your Medicare premium is actually based on your modified adjusted gross income. And so if your income is high enough, you can actually end up paying more for your Part B and your Part D premiums. There's a few different Medicare tax brackets. And the way this works is it's essentially a 2-year delay. So if you recognize higher levels of income in 2022, your Medicare premium may be higher in the year 2024. And then in 2025, it'll go off 2023 and so forth into the future. So it's really a temporary increase in the year that you do that, but with a delay. Now, something to pay really close attention to is the Medicare tax brackets do not have a phase out. And what I mean by that is even if you go above the bracket by even just $1, you're gonna pay that increased Medicare premium. So there really isn't a phase out there where if you go above $10, it'll increase your Medicare premium by X dollars. It's $1 over, you're in that Medicare tax bracket. So sometimes when you do a Roth conversion projection, it's really important to pay attention to what tax bracket you fall into. So if you're trying to target, say, the top of the 22% or the 24% tax bracket, and that's going to bump you into the next Medicare tax bracket by, say, maybe $3,000 or, in my example, maybe $1 even, it may not make sense to go to the top of that bracket. You may want to pare that back a little bit. And that's why it's really important to get a good sense of what your income will be for the year. Obviously, it is nice to do these projections earlier in the year because if you can get money growing in a tax-free account, the market goes up more often than it goes down. But there are some added benefits to waiting till the end of the year when you have a better sense of what your income will be, so that way you can fine-tune the amount that you actually want to convert to the Roth IRA. This isn't tax advice, but something that I have noticed over the years when I do these Roth conversion projections is that a lot of people who are falling in the 22 or 24% tax bracket that may get hit with a higher Medicare premium is that it only adds roughly 1 percentage point to the effective rate of tax. And what I mean by that is, let's say that your effective rate of tax on the Roth conversion is 24%. Oftentimes when you factor in the increased Medicare premium and see that as an additional tax on top of whatever federal tax you're paying, it usually adds 1 percentage point. So if the effective tax rate of the conversion was roughly 24%, with the Medicare premium factored in, it often is around 25%. You may be wondering, should you withhold taxes on a Roth conversion? Ideally, no. If you have brokerage assets or cash that you can pay to do the Roth conversion, usually it makes more sense to make those via estimated tax payments, because if you do a Roth conversion, let's say you want to move $100,000, I'm just throwing out a random number, but if you want to move $100,000, if you withhold taxes on that conversion, let's say you want to withhold 20%, $20,000 is going to go to the government and isn't going to go into the Roth IRA that's growing tax-free. So instead of $100,000 growing tax-free, you now only have $80,000 growing tax-free. It'd be much better to do the full conversion, move $100,000 to the Roth IRA, and then pay the tax via an estimated tax payment from a brokerage account. You could sell something in there, or if you have cash at the bank, you could use that to pay the tax, because you do want as much money as possible making it into the Roth IRA for that tax-free growth. Something that isn't always explicitly stated is that the more money you can move from the IRA to a Roth IRA, the lower your income will likely be in the future. Because if we go back to that example as if, pretend we're Bruce here and we just want to defer tax as long as possible, his IRA is going to continue to grow. And at some point, age 72, the requirement of distributions are going to start. And what a lot of people fail to realize is if you do a tremendous job saving, you're actually going to have pretty high required minimum distributions as time goes on. It could potentially be hundreds of thousands of dollars by the time you're age 80 or 90. And you can imagine that combined with Social Security plus other portfolio income, that can push you in a really high tax bracket, depending on what tax brackets are in that time. I'd recommend reaching out to an accountant or a financial planner to help you do the actual analysis to make sure it makes sense in your situation. To wrap things up, Roth conversions can make a lot of sense for people in the early part of retirement, people in the 22 or 24% tax bracket today who may see higher tax brackets in 2026, since the default trajectory is that we're going to see higher taxes then in narrower brackets. If you found this video helpful, please click that like button and subscribe to this channel. Enjoy.